Hello and welcome to Project Kermit 1 Year on the Road special update episode. Over those 12 months we've covered just over 7,000 miles under its own steam and about 300 miles on the back of a recovery truck, but we'll get to that story. For the first time with a vehicle I've actually kept a diary. So not only do I have a list of all the fuel fill-up so I can work out miles per gallon, but I've also written down every service item, every tweak, every modification and every outright repair that I've had to do. So with this and some footage to go with it, of course, I should be able to give you a decent impression of 12 months in the life of Kermit as a daily driver and absolute workhorse. So the first trip in here in January of last year was a 460 mile round trip, Shakedown trip, Kermit's first journey out into the world. And I went from here to the Welsh borders, collected my mate Mark, took him right across the country to collect Grandad and take Grandad out for lunch with us. And all this was in aid of, well, it was Grandad's birthday, but also in aid of, those two have been such a help to me over the course of Project Kermit, and I wanted them to share the joy of getting the project over the finish line. 460 miles logged and fixed the connector on the alternator, actually, during the trip. Splendid, I thought. Kermit was ready for work. Now, having a working truck, this meant getting on with so many things I just couldn't do before. So many trips to the scrapyard, the builder's yard, timber yard, and I could get on with other big projects like rebuilding my kitchen. It was on a trip far from home collecting some kitchen units that the first issue cropped up, and that's the Turbo Blue. Now this turbo was a turbo that I got 10-15 years ago of quite dubious provenance, so I wasn't entirely surprised. I replaced it with a brand new OEM one and moved on. Second issue we had was what I thought at the time was a fuel issue. Well, I did find a fuel issue. There was a tiny hole in the diaphragm, a rubber diaphragm on the injector pump. Again, replaced that with an OEM one, moved on. Then, early in March, I set off to visit my partner Katie, who at the time lived in North Yorkshire. Now I'm down here in Somerset, so that's over 300 miles away. Fair old trek. And for the first 100 miles or so, everything was fine. We were bombing it up the motorway. And then somewhere around the Birmingham area, there's that heart-stopping moment when the engine falters, and I pulled off the motorway. I checked what I couldn't find anything wrong with it, got it going again and carried on. It wasn't quite right. I could do about 50 or so, and that took me the next 100 miles. The last 120 miles I was down to about 26 miles per hour. It just wouldn't go above high idle engine revs. Just couldn't do it. So I got to my destination, but the journey home, that was on a recovery truck. The driver of the first recovery truck was a Land Rover fan. Great, I thought, but no. What is it, he said, pointing at Kermit. It's a Series 3, I said. No, he said, pointing across the yard. That's a Series 3. He had this immaculate short wheelbase Series 3 and Coast Guard livery. That, pointing back at Kermit, that's a mishmash. Now, I've upset plenty of people over the course of Project Kermit with what I've done to this Land Rover, but none as much as Bernie. And of course, we were stuck in the cab together for the next several hours. He did thaw out a bit over the journey, and in fairness, he was very good at his job, which I guess is the only thing that really matters. So Bernie took Kermit and I the first 100 or so miles south, and then left us in a motorway services for the next recovery truck. 5.5 hours I was there. It felt longer. It was a really busy lorry park, and I just couldn't leave the Land Rover unattended for very long. And then just as I was losing the will to live, a 40-ton lorry pulls in and the driver jumps out, "Kermit!" Massive fan of the project. I'm just sorry you got to see it in such sad circumstances. But thank you very much, Triple Dave, if you're watching, for keeping me company for the last half hour or so. Finally, the second recovery truck turned up. I was on my way again. One more handover to one more recovery truck, and finally I was home about 17 hours after setting out from Katie's at 6 that morning. What a day. About a week later, I made an update video for my patrons, and I'll show you a little clip from that. I had a lot of time to think about things as I was sat in a motorway lorry park waiting for the next truck to turn up. And it occurred to me that, think how long I spent working on the structure of Kermit. So just take the chassis. How long did I spend on the chassis? The chassis is perfect. But how long did I spend on the engine? If I spent months on the chassis, I spent days, just a few days on the engine. Well, I basically did the timing belt on the front here, a couple of oil seals, changed the filters, and considered it good to go. And I was telling myself, well, it was a good engine. I was driving about in that in the Range Rover, but that was probably a decade ago. Now I thought, and the chap from the recovery garage also thought, that I'd blown the head gasket. So when I got back here, changed the head gasket, same problem. I'm now thinking possibly a crack in the cylinder head, but I'm still trying to chase it down, still trying to work out what it is. I have to face the fact that I skimped on two rather important things, the engine and the transmission. As you saw there, at that time I was still unsure about what the problem was. Was it a cracked head, air getting into the fuel, some kind of fuel blockage? Just couldn't pin it down. What we have here is my spare engine. It's the same type of engine as is in Kermit. This also came out of Range Rover actually. So this is also a 200 TDI diesel engine. This one I'm going to rebuild completely. I'm going to basically do what I should have done during Project Kermit and completely strip this down and rebuild it. So it'll effectively be a new engine when I've finished. Now I use this engine to swap the injectors into the original engine, no change. Swap out the injector pump, no change. Whatever I did, it would drive fine up to about 40 minutes in and then just die. And then start up again, but wouldn't rev beyond high tick over. Incredibly frustrating, to be honest. It's been going on for weeks now, and I'm still no nearer actually working out what the fundamental issue with it. I found problems and fixed them, but the fundamental issue still remains. I dropped the tank and cleaned it, checked the air vent, pressure tested the fuel pipe, and indeed the whole fuel system. Changed the lift pump and everything else I can think of. Around about that time, I changed two of the clocks here from the Defender spec ones to these rather nice VDO ones. So I've got a much more precise temperature gauge, and instead of the voltmeter that I had, I've now got a oil pressure gauge. And that's just for peace of mind. For all this worry about the engine, I just needed some real-time data to tell me that things were, well, not going okay, but not about to go catastrophically wrong either. Then, just as I was about to take the rather drastic step of taking the cylinder head off of the spare engine and swapping it with the one in here, I finally figured it out. And it was actually something really trivial. When I installed the engine, I had to figure out how to get from the air filter here to the turbo down there. And to do that, I used this. This is a flexible silicone hose. And I thought, brilliant, I've done all of that with one part. And everything worked brilliantly for the first probably 1,000 miles. Trouble is though, after a couple of months, this material got softer. At the back there, you've got a really sharp 90-degree turn. And I think that's where the problem was. So what was happening was, I'd start the engine, with the engine cold, everything would be fine. But then as it all warms up in the engine bay here, that joint would get softer, and at some point it would just shut off. So there's a pinch point. It was actually just choking the air supply to the engine. So it's just literally being choked. And that's all it was. What I've done now is adapt a 300 TDI system. So remember, Kermit is running now, it's a 200 TDI engine, but a 300 TDI turbo on it for clearance. It's mostly a standard 300 TDI part, but I've cut it and put in an extra section there, a aluminium elbow there, and this blue connector there onto the turbo. Once I fitted this new intake system, everything just worked again. I gave it a month or so, and then when I was confident everything was just tickety-boo, I tweaked the injector pump slightly using the advice from a really good video, which I'll link below, and that did make a difference. Now I can do 70 miles an hour if I really want to. Next few months, not much to report. In June I gave it a full service and a good check over, and by that point I was really getting my confidence back in the machine. And that's just as well because a big mission was coming up. Plenty of small missions too, such as this trip out to collect a car lift. Just one more bargain I'd have had to let go of even a year earlier. Kermit lugged this massive trailer all the way to the south coast and back again without any issues. I went back up north to see Katie a few times actually, and on one occasion collecting her motorbike, some fruit trees, and dropping her off in the Lake District and coming back here with everything else. can see here page after page with nothing listed but fuel stops. Fuel consumption here is a steady 35 or so. So we got 35.05. That's the best I ever got, I think, 36.69. Go back a minute. 35.01. That's the service. 35.07, 36 again, 36.24. And this is mostly driving at lorry speeds. Now it will go quicker, and that's dead useful when when you're behind a lorry and you come to a hill and the lorry slows down. I can then just pull out and bomb past it and then settle down to 55, 60 again. There is one entry that shows a sharp dip in the fuel economy down to 31.37, and that's just after I did those tweaks to the fuel injector pump. And I was just enjoying the extra pep of the engine until the novelty wore off. Other than that, it's 35, 36 all the way. So staying over 60 is just not worth the extra fuel. So talking of extra fuel, you know what's coming next? Well, that's not looking good.
We're in, you're in, we're in.
A wheel came off the trailer. That was my fault. I should have checked the wheel nuts. I checked the wheel tyre pressures, but I didn't check the wheel nuts. And the overheating, guess what? That was my fault too. And we didn't realise this until quite a while later, that although the engine fan, so Kermit has got an electric engine fan rather than the pulley driven one, it was running, but somehow in between testing it on the workbench and installing it in the vehicle, I'd swapped the connectors over, so it was running backwards and not cooling the engine at all. Now a 200 TDI doesn't normally need a cooling fan, so it was only when I had a huge load on the back and a 1 in 4 hill to climb that I had to put the fan on, and yeah, it didn't do anything at all. So my fault again. Just after that epic hill climb, we pulled into a small dead-end road and fitted some trailer stabilizers and also redistributed the ballast in the back of Kermit here. Big thanks to another Kermit fan, Brian, that we met on the little dead-end road for guiding us back out onto the main road. So reversing such a rig, even with the extra wide mirrors that I had on, is a bit of a nightmare. So thanks, Brian. Hope you're doing well. The entire rest of the 300 miles passed without incident. We stopped fairly often at the services, pulling in at lorry park to the delight of truck drivers who took photos and asked a lot of questions. Fuel economy dropped to 22.4 and top speed dropped to about 32. We set off late afternoon, we drove all night and we got here early the next morning.
I didn't do anything. More than you. You did everything. I've done it.
Since then, we've had a few more adventures. We went out to collect a woodworking machine and found some snow to play in. And then our most recent trip was to go and get a bandsaw, and we did that via Salisbury Plain, where we did some gentle off-roading just for fun.
We're having a jolly time.
I do still intend to rebuild the spare engine that's in the workshop. The one that's in here is running really well, but it is getting on a bit. The oil pressure is low. It's within spec, but it's right at the bottom of spec, and that tells me that it's getting a bit tired. I'm happy to drive it anywhere within the UK, but I want a new engine in there before we go further afield, and we do want to go much further afield. This engine now has that new turbo, new injectors, new injector pump, and all the other gubbins on it. I can transfer all of that over to the spare engine once I've rebuilt the block on that one, and then I'll have the next best thing to a complete new engine. I will swap the gearbox at some point. This one's not great, but I'm going to put off that job until I've got the car lift up and running. Since finishing the build, I've had lots of ideas for further enhancements for Kermit. Side impact bars, central locking. I've even got a nifty idea for a wheel clamp. But the only one that I've actually got round to building so far, well, the only big one, is this. I built this door and spare wheel kit, and I'm really pleased with it. It does free up an awful lot of room in the back here. Initially, all that was here was a 12mm bolt for the door to latch to. One of my patrons was the first to mention that what I actually needed was one of these. So this is the receiver from a Defender, and this holds the door lock really snugly inside here, and it takes away all the up and down movement. Another enhancement I want before we go abroad is to construct a camper body, a demountable one. I've got a design in mind which is quite different to anything else that I've seen, and that should be quite a fun build. But before that, and indeed the very next thing that I'm going to do to the Land Rover, is fit power steering. So this was never part of the original plan for Kermit, but now having done over 7,000 miles on the manual steering, I'm pretty sick of it. I did 20 years of manual steering on the old Land Rover, and it never bothered me, but of course that Land Rover can barely get over 40 miles an hour. This one, it's fine up to 40, but beyond that, it just gets unacceptably vague. I'm going to fit the system from a Range Rover P38. It's worth remembering that the manual steering here was designed for the Series 1. So it's a 1940s design for basically for a farm vehicle. I have a requirement for going at motorway speeds for hours on end. So it does need upgrading. Plus, having done that, Katie will be able to drive it as well. Well, there we go then. Not quite a trouble-free 12 months motoring, but the only two things that really went wrong were just silly errors, and my fault entirely. So we had that air hose and swapping the connectors on the fan, which meant it was ineffective and let the engine overheat. But no harm done. And when it comes to the big missions, Kermit really excels. It's still my dream vehicle, and I still love looking at it, let alone driving it. But best of all is to be driving it as Katie and I head out on another adventure. And you can all come along as well. Cheers for now.